Hi, I'm Hermela Argawi. Thanks for watching. Today, we're going to be talking about the controversy around the Ethiopian government's move to restructure the regional police force or special forces. The government says the process is underway in all of the regions, but some in the Amhara region in particular are resisting. They say they're being singled out, question the timing, and believe the move will make them vulnerable to the forces in the neighboring Tigray region. That is where the Tigray People's Liberation Front hails from. A 2-year war between the TPLF and the government ended in November in a peace deal. The forces in the Amhara region, including the regional forces and the Fano militia, fought alongside the government, but right now they are at a sticking point. So, what is happening between some of the militias and the regional forces in the Amhara region in particular and the federal government? Well, the Washington Post reported today that there were clashes in the town of Kobo and 4 people were killed, 2 Ethiopian aid workers and 2 Fano militias. I reached out to both federal government officials and the regional officials to confirm this, but I haven't been able to confirm that. But we do know that there were protests in the Amhara region, multiple regions over the weekend and late last week. There were people that were putting out rocks in the roads so that the Ethiopian National Defense Forces weren't able to come in. And there's a lot of talk on this issue. So I want to bring in my guest today, Darasa Casa, to talk about some of these issues, Darasa. I really want to kind of dissect the people's voice because there's a lot being said, by the federal government. There's some communication coming out, but what the people are hearing or believing is very different from that. So, what's your general take at this point about what the government has said and what the people on the ground, as well as those in the diaspora, believe?
Oh, thanks for having me, Hermela. It's a pleasure to be back with you. Yes, when you and me were talking back in November 20, a day after the Pretoria peace agreement was signed, there was a lot of relief, was a lot of hope and optimism that the Tigray war is over, the TPLF would be disarmed, and some sort of a political settlement between the federal government, the Amhara state, and the Tigray region would be found as far as the disputed Wolkaites, Agadins, Alimt, Waradas are concerned. But things took a different turn, and we see an escalation of tension, political tension, and deep mistrust between the Amhara region itself and the federal government, but by and large between the Amhara public and the feds. And this, I believe, has to do with a lot of issues, Hermela, but let me single out a couple of matters. One is, as you know, following Pretoria, the Nairobi Declaration, and some sort of a protocol on disarmament, demobilization, and rehabilitation procedures was signed, and it says ENDF forces would stay in Tigray, but all non-ENDF forces, which means the Amhara Special Forces and the Eritrean forces, need to evacuate from Tigray. What was not clear in that agreement, and I think it's by design, is whether that applies to Wolkait, Agadin, Alimt, which the Amhara region claims is forcefully taken and annexed back in 1991, or the same region that TPLF and the Tigrayan public in general now considers as Western Tigray, right? So when the push to disarm the Amhara Special Forces came, fast forward now, everybody's thinking that this is a ploy by the federal government to literally neuter the armed wing of the Amhara regional state, which would make Amhara region virtually incapable of defending these regions if, say, the federal government and the TPLF agree that these provinces get returned to Tigray. So a lot of the paranoia and a lot of the anxiety about the disarmament and demobilization has a lot to do with the future fate of Wolkait and Sagede, and on whether Abiy Ahmed's administration has reached some sort of a tacit agreement on returning back these provinces to Tigray before any constitutional settlements. That is the mother of the problems. That is the core of the issue. But two more things, Hermela. As you know, over the past 5 years, while the Tigray war itself was ongoing, there is this relentless killing of ethnic Amharas in Oromia, by the OLF and the OLF Shane Armed Front. And people know, even the federal government itself admits that there are collaborators within the Oromia state with this OLF Shane forces. And there is a lot of frustration, a lot of anger and resentment by Amharas by and large that their fellow Amharas are being massacred in Oromia and the Abiy administration is not doing anything to protect them. This also added fuel to the already raging sentiment of resentment by the Amharas. Last but not least, we see what happened with the Orthodox Tewahedo Church affair. As you know, the overwhelming majority of Amharas happen to be Tewahedo believers, and they felt that both the Oromia regional state and Abiy Ahmed himself somewhat conspired to have a splinter group, which later called itself the Oromia Synod and broke away from the church. And that brought all the confrontation and dispute and the protests in Addis that later on Abiy Ahmed himself backpedaled and some sort of a reconciliation was arranged. All of these steps, or you could say missteps, are seen by Amharas in general and a majority of non-Amhara pan-Ethiopians that the Amhara region is being sidelined and a new alliance between Abiy Ahmed and the TPLF is in the offing. But all of these are, to be honest, assertions, and they're not substantiated by any clear evidence.
At this point, what do you think the federal government could do to fill in this trust gap that seems to be present, particularly with forces in the Amhara region? I'm not sure how widespread it is among the people, but we certainly hear it in the diaspora. Regardless of some of the communication that has come out from the federal government over the weekend and last week, that trust appears to persist. So what do you think can be done to fill that gap?
Hermela, when you look at these developments as a string of developments, one cascading into another, the trust deficit has grown so much. And there was this, I don't know, it's willful ignorance or it's sheer incompetence. There is this secrecy and opaqueness on the part of the federal government and the incumbent party, Prosperity Party, to drop these things unannounced, and the public hears them as if they're like breaking news, right? So while all of these mistrust and conspiracy theories were swirling around and in the public domain, the government has been radio silent. And all of a sudden last week, we heard this news that all special forces and entirely are about to be disarmed. But now one controversy happening is people are saying, the detractors of the government are saying, no other region is actually disarming. This is not happening in Oromia. This is not happening in the south. This is not happening in Somali region. As a matter of fact, they're saying the decision to communicate these to the security officers of the regional states happened 6 days ago, right? So what sort of, public awareness, what sort of going to the public and telling the intent of the government to the public was done to prep the people? Virtually little to nothing. So there's a huge communication gap, and this calls for a deliberate PR strategy on the part of the government to preempt these conversations and to show its real intent instead of allowing it to go and then spread like wildfire. And now you're trying to, to stamp out this and to clear your position in a very much, defensive position. And I don't know how much of the trust could be salvaged, to be honest with you, Hermela.
Let's dissect this, how much was actually communicated to the people that needed to hear it issue. There was a meeting a couple of days ago. I just came across the video, so I'm not trying to gotcha you at all, because I just saw it too today, where you had the security heads of all the regions, including the Amhara region, the Oromia region, Afar, Somalia. Those four spoke, but I believe other regional heads were there and saying this was in process, similar to what the General Ababa the Army deputy chief said is that this has been in process. We've been working on it. It didn't come out of nowhere. So maybe the question is, and I did talk to somebody in the defense ministry over the weekend that said we communicated to the regional heads, and maybe they didn't communicate to the people underneath them, which it would also be an issue, right? So let's listen to what the security head of the Oromia region said. This is a part of a larger speech where he says we're doing it in our region too, and then we can discuss afterwards.
አሁን የሚወሩ ወሬዎች አንደኛው ይሄ አክራሪ ኃይል አገሪቱ እንድትፈርስ ሌላ የፖለቲካ ችግር ያለባቸው ህዝቡን አቅፎ የራሳቸውን አጀንዳ መሸጥ የማይችሉ በዚህ ተንተርሶ አገሪቱን የማፍረስ ህዝብ ለህዝብ ግጭት እንዲኖር የፖለቲካ ትርፍ እናገኛለን ብሎ የሚያነሱ ኃይሎች ናቸው። ስለዚህ ይሄ ወደፊትም መታረም ያለበት አዋጪ ስላልሆነ ከዚህ ቢታቀቡ የተሻለ ይሆናል።
በፌደራል ፖሊስ ውስጥ ተደራጅቶ ነው የሚቀጽለው። በመደበኛ ፖሊስ በክልል መደበኛ ፖሊስ ውስጥ ታቅፎ ነው የሚቀጽለው። ትጥቅ ማስፈታት የሚባለው በትክክልም የህዝብን ስነ ልቦናን ለማዛባት የተጠቀሙበት ሌሎች ኃይሎች የተጠቀሙበት ካልሆነ በስተቀር ትጥቅ መፍታት የሚባለው ነገር የለም።
So there's one more clip I want to play before we discuss that. Let's kind of summarize what they're saying. That's the head of security and then the police commissioner of the Oromia region. He's saying we're not telling people to disarm, which seems to be how a lot of people are hearing what's happening, that they essentially are going to be disarming if they do not go into these structures, the federal structure that's being presented for them. And then something that happens a lot, or we're hearing more and more, is this accusation that, you know, it's these political forces that want to use these grievances for their political way, want to destroy the country. So we can also talk about that as a second issue. Let's hear from the Amhara region security head.
ሀገራዊ የሆነ ተናባቢ የሆነ ለህዝቦች ዜግነት እኩልነት ዜጎች ትረስት የሚሰጡት የጸጥታ መዋቅር መገንባት አስፈላጊ ሆኖ ተገኝቷል። ይሄ ስራ አስፈጻሚያችን ወስኖ የቆየውን ጥናት አሁን ወደ ተግባራ ተገብቷል። ለህዝብ አገልግሎት መስዋዕት ሲከፍሉ የነበሩ የጸጥታ ኃይሎቻችን ሌላ ተጨማሪ ተልእኮና ያደገ ተልእኮ ከመስጠት ያለፈ በተደራጀና የዚህ ሰንሰለቱ ተናባቢ በሆነ መንገድ ስምሪት ለመስጠት በሚያመች መንገድ ለማደራጀት እንደሆነ ታሳቢ መደረግ አለበት።
What do you think?
Hermela, this meeting was an effort by the government to dispel all the criticism and the protests that arrived on its doorsteps. And you're right. If this was the true intent of the government, they could have done this thing of letting the public be aware of what is to come, what the true intent and objective of disarming the special forces is about, and that it has been planned and it's about to be executed nationwide. None of that happened, right? So now they are sort of explaining this. It's like reverse engineering. They're now saying, now that all these protests are going, by the way, Hermela, I digress, but in the latest I checked, 5 people have been shot in Marawi town, which is 40 kilometers outside the capital, Bahir Dar. And protests were going on in more than 12 towns now. This is my latest tally, right? There was also another standoff and shootout in Kobo that you rightfully mentioned. And then my point is, you could have done this job of being, full court press presence and telling the public, not just the Amharas, but everybody else in the country, and then explaining that your true intent is to reintegrate these special forces into the federal forces. But that topic of it's not disarming them, it is reintegrating them, that requires a very delicate dissection. You know why, Hermela? Yes, these troops, which are now under the purview of the Amhara regional state, the special forces, could be transferred and become part and parcel of the Federal National Defense Forces. That means they would be under the control and command chain of the federal government. In that sense, as private troops or officers, they get to keep their arms. I get that. But when we say disarmament, we're saying the regional government would no more have a militia force, an organized armed force that it can single-handedly command and control. In that sense, the regional states are being disarmed, okay? Because they would never have that force, which would be at the beck and call of their command. In other words, for instance, if there was to be, God forbid, knock on wood, a showdown between Tigray and Amhara National Regional State, if this disarmament process is peacefully concluded, it means the Amhara National Regional State would not have any force of its own that it can command to go into a military standoff with Tigray. Okay? So if you see it in terms of bequeathing power and transferring power, I'm talking about armed power, violent power from the regional states to the federal government. In that sense, it's a disarmament. But as far as, each and every individual is concerned, or whether they're going to stay in the armed forces and whether they're going to stay as troops and soldiers of the federal government is concerned, it may not be seen as disarmament, right? And a lot of the resistance is coming from the second point that I'm trying to hammer here. People in Amhara Regional State feel like Walqait and Sagede are still disputed. The TPLF did not disarm its light weapons, though it disarmed some of its heavy weapons. And they feel like if the federal government is not going to come to their rescue, they will not have any means to defend themselves. And therefore, they feel like this is a unilateral disarmament venture, somewhat concocted by Abiy Ahmed and company.
It's very interesting. There appear to be some similarities and, of course, some differences between the way that some of the issues in the Tigray region as it relates to the war and sort of what we're hearing dog whistles of now, if there was to be conflict between the forces in the Amhara region and the federal government. How do you think Tigray and Amhara, as it relates to their issues with the government, are similar or different?
Hermela, this is a very bad place to be in as a country. I mean, the level of mistrust that you have, we're almost treating each other as foreigners. Think about it. The federal Ethiopian National Defense Force is being roadblocked by Amharas, right? The same thing happened before Tigray went on a full revolt against, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. And to be honest with you, Hermela, even though I'm sad, but it is something to be expected. And I'll tell you why. What would you expect if you have literally confederated your nation along ethnic lines and only ethnic lines, all right? And you give these regional states unprecedented amount of both political and economic power, and you finally resort to weaponizing them. You give them special forces. All 14 regions have special forces now, right? And there's a lot of mistrust between each of these regional states. Amhara and Tigray are a case in point, but there are territorial disputes between Somali and Oromia region, between Sidama and Oromia, between, Benishangul Gumuz and Amhara region, Benishangul Gumuz and Oromia region. So it means you now have a recipe for an outburst of violence everywhere you have territorial disputes and border disputes between the regional states. So in principle, what the federal government is trying to do is to retake the monopoly of violence from all these regional forces, centrifugal forces, and at least have a means whereby every territorial dispute is not going to be violently contested, and you would not have mini civil wars breaking out left and right. So in principle, there's nothing wrong with what the federal government is trying to achieve. In fact, it is right. The problem is the ruling coalition, Prosperity Party itself, is divided. There is deep mistrust between Amhara PP, the Amhara Prosperity Party leaders, and the Oromia Prosperity Party leaders. This mistrust has also got to do with what people now think is a realignment of alliance between Oromo people on the one hand and the prime minister on the other, and the Amharas feeling that they're being pushed out to the margins, right? So like I said, it's sort of a natural consequence of what happened in this country over the past 32 years, though unfortunate and tragic. And how is this similar to the situation of Tigray? It is similar in the sense that both the Tigrayan elite pre-2020 and now the Amharas feel like they're being left out from the center. They're being pushed out by the Oromo elite. They are no more partners at the center, but they are being peripheralized, right? And so they think the resort to armed resistance is one way of securing some position of influence, some position of bargain against the center. In that sense, they're very similar, Hermel.
So there's there's a difference between whether Amharas feel like they're represented or not by those that are in power within the Prosperity Party versus they feel more represented if there are some of the regional there's some popular political folks within the region that they would like to see sit at the table. There was an advocacy to have Amhara regional representatives at the table in Pretoria. We didn't see that happening, but what we do know for sure about armed conflict is that it's always the people that get hurt, right? We saw that Absolutely. From Tigray, and yet, there is a sense that this one would be justified as what people, that are coming from the Amhara regions or that support some of the resistance there are saying. But as we saw with Tigray, it just took us backwards. So what is the path forward? What are a few different paths that you could see happening from here on out?
Yeah. Who wants to see another rerun of what happened over the past 2 years? I mean, the conservative estimate is we lost around 600,000 Ethiopians in 2 years' time, right? We sustained a damage which is now estimated to the tune of $30 billion US. 30 billion. Imagine all of these means schools and hospitals and health centers, airports, and everything that this poor country has invested on for decades was, it was destroyed, right? So I for one do not think that this conflict between the Amhara public and the Amhara region to a given extent and the federal government should go down the road of a violent confrontation. I hope and I pray honestly that it would not go down that road. What other mechanisms do we have? That's a great question, Hermela. Nothing but dialogue, right? And the first order of dialogue should be for the Amhara Prosperity Party leaders themselves and the federal government officials to come to the Amhara region and face the public and convince the public that this is not something done to isolate and to victimize Amhara. This is not to leave them insecure and defenseless, given what the Amharas feel, which is an impending strike by the TPLF, and that this is not a solution to resolve the issue of Wolkait and Tsagede, right? So there should be a massive exertion of effort and communication and dialogue on the part of the federal government and the Amhara regional state to literally calm down the public and to convince the public and to find other mechanisms of resolving these misunderstandings. My worry is it would be too late, because right now what I see is, I see two things. On the one hand, the government is beaming out this message saying, oh, this has been decided upon, deliberated upon. It's only some elements who want power and who want to destabilize peace who are doing this. On the other hand, the government is kind of beaming the signal that, if you try to resist and to protest, we'll crack down on it, right? And so you're sending out a mixed signal as a federal government. The problem is the more you threaten people, the more they become apprehensive, the more they become hostile, and they may not have the goodwill to, wait and listen to you and hear you out and reason with you, right? And so, as far as I'm concerned, Hermela, I think there's no way out except for dialogue between the Amhara regional state leaders and the federal government officials with the Amhara populace, the Amhara public in general. I'll add one more thing. I think there should be a very honest discussion between the TPLF and the Amhara regional state. These two cannot just, literally skirt around this issue of Walqait and Sagadi. There's a prisoner dilemma. They seriously believe that, this is going to be resolved by either some sort of a constitutional means or by force. I don't think both options are good options, to be honest with you, because they would have a zero-sum sense to them. One would win, the other would lose. The only way that both the Tigrayan people and the Amharas could win is if these two come together to the table and find out a way where they can devise a win-win solution on these provinces of Walqait and Sagadi. If we tackle that, much of the paranoia around disarmament of special forces and all that could be resolved, Hermel.
And I think your point, or you're mentioning the Constitution, would also be problematic, as under the Constitution, it falls under Tigray, because the Constitution that we have is still the one that TPLF created in the early 1990s. Isn't there something in the middle? And I guess that's what you're saying in terms of having the TPLF leadership or the Tigray leadership and the Amhara leadership. But when we say that, who are we talking about? Because if we're talking about Getachew Reda and then the Amhara PP, I don't think the people are going to like that. So who is going to be at the table for that?
So let's talk about options. As you just mentioned, if you were to settle this along constitutional lines, for one, and then you believe that whatever the borders existed pre-2018 should be restored, so there's no dispute. These provinces should be immediately handed over to Tigray. But you can only imagine the kind of resistance, the kind of violence and bloodshed that could break out when the Amhara forces in Walqait Sagadi are told to leave. So I think short term, that is a recipe for disaster, okay? Neither would the Tigrayans just let it go. Just because the Amharas and the federal government had a military upper hand today and they took it away from them by force, that doesn't mean Tigray would, relinquish its request on these provinces. It will. As a matter of fact, Getachew Reda, the first thing he mentioned on his statement was, he said, my first order of business is to make sure these provinces are returned back to us. So, these two options for me are, they're very risky, right? So what I'm thinking is either craft a special regional administrative zone, something like Addis Ababa, which is now under federal jurisdiction, or Dredawa, where, the federal government, until some long-lasting settlement is gained, would have jurisdiction over these provinces. So neither the Amharas nor the Tigrayans would have, jurisdiction over it, right? But I don't think that's a lasting solution. Another solution would be to think about an arrangement where both the Tigrayan and the Amhara regional state officials would run the province together. So basically share power, right? That's also another option you can think of. A third option, which is not in the horizon, is maybe big picture, if the current constitutional design is revisited. Let's say the Ethiopian public settles that the Amhara region be broken down into 3 or 4 provinces or Oromia, and we now have a new territorial configuration, right? And that sort of arrangement, the issue of with Walqait, with Tigray, or with Amhara, that could be redundant, but we are not there yet, right? So, go ahead.
Yeah. To your point, it's a conflict area, right? So there's a movement that says, it was Amhara region before TPLF, so now it's Amhara land. And then, of course, the people from Tigray or activists are saying, it's Tigrayan land because of the Constitution. And it just seems like both of those choices aren't really holistic and aren't going to bring a lasting solution. So I think I agree with some of what you're saying there. There seems to be a repeated, at least in the last several months, and probably further back than that, a pattern with the government not understanding the pulse of the people. You know, we saw it with the Orthodox Church, regardless of what your opinion was about it. Certainly, people felt very emotional about the issue, and the government eventually had to try to come in and create some peace. And there may be something of that nature here too, right? That they did not really foresee the type of resistance that they might get from the people. But if you look at, you know, if you look back a little bit, it wouldn't be that difficult to foresee this. Why do you think this keeps happening? And with that foundation, what do you think is going to happen next? Do you think the government's going to actually have a conversation about this?
So why is this happening? A couple of issues. One, this is a country which has been going through a grilling war for more than 2 years now, right? Not to mention the economic downturn, right? This, the cost of living is really high. Poverty has increased. Unemployment is high. You have a youth bulge. Think about it. 60% of this country's population is under 30, right? And you're talking about kids who are either in school or they're looking for jobs, right? This is a country which is sitting on a powder cake, right? A lot of the times we are so caught up in the politics of it, we don't realize that life, I'm talking about livelihoods in Ethiopia, and the level of economic insecurity, unemployment, and extreme poverty in that country means you literally conflict is like, pouring gasoline on a raging fire. Right? Poverty and violence, this, Hermela, are very much complementary. They feed off of each other. So you have a restive population. You have a population which is already violentized and at the same time impoverished. And add to that fray the fact that this government, like you were saying, is usually lagging behind when it comes to its PR front, its public relations front. And I'm not the only one. A lot of people, a lot of criticisms were coming its way. Remember when the war was being waged against the TPLF, how the TPLF was, masterminding all the narratives which were being peddled on Western media, print media, electronic media, and how they dominated this narrative. That they are not the perpetrators. They're not the ones who started the war, but the government. That this government has actually committed all kinds of atrocities and they are, helpless victims. And so that affair tells you that this government does not think that it has to consult and it has to be transparent and it has to take measures of building public confidence before it undertakes sensitive projects like disarming a regional state all by itself, right? You can't just have a meeting and then dispatch a bunch of letters and say, hey, this has been agreed upon and we're about to disarm 40,000 young people. There would be a backlash. So that's what I'm seeing, Hermela. So I think there's a yawning gap as far as their potential to communicate and to stir public opinion is concerned. I don't know if that's because, the EPRDF has always been authoritarian. It never cared for opinion polls or public reception. It's like might is right. Whatever we want to do, we want to do. But what they don't understand is PP is navigating a different space. Now, you let the YouTube and the private media, independent electronic media, you expose the public to all kinds of opinions. You have a public which is already riled up and you're not saying or doing anything. I mean, you should expect that when these airwaves are crowded with all sorts of messages, your message could be drowned by it,
Right. To that point, we've heard the government or government officials, I'll say specifically Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in a recent parliament speech talking about the responsibility that comes with press freedom and just freedom in general, and that people have to be really careful about what information they're absorbing or they're sharing, especially in delicate times. But I think the point that you're making is with that freedom that they're giving people, at least relatively speaking, compared to the EPRDF era, there's also seems to be more of a responsibility responsibility on the government to explain and over-explain. There's an adage that we have in journalism that says, tell them what you're gonna tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. So people really need you to say it a few different times, particularly when the issues are big. So do you see that being, the source of the problem, and do you see it changing on the government's part?
I hope it's changed, but I don't see it changing. Let me give you an example. The only time the prime minister gives a press interview is when he shows up at the parliament and he takes questions from members of parliament. He never addresses the nation. He never has a State of the Union address, for instance, right? He never takes interviews from private media or public media one-on-ones, right? He never gave a press interview to international media. Have you noticed that? He's been in power for 5 years, right? And what does this tell you? Like, a lot of the times, whatever you get from the government's media outlets, including, by the way, the Office of the Prime Minister's Twitter handle, and Facebook, is he makes a speech in Parliament, and some nondescript personality would take threads out of his impromptu speech, and they would post it on Twitter, and that's policy, right? In fact, I was on record literally criticizing the prime minister that he always goes impromptu. He never speaks scripted. He does not address. Like, I'm a university lecturer. I have the privilege of doing that. But when you are a head of state and you're talking about disarming, militia and special forces, you should be very careful about what is the text of the message. Who are my surrogates? Did I already give a heads up to the public and do the work before the execution of the project? And so everything that you know of, Hermela, I think all of this knowledge is foreign to these folks because, they came of age in a political culture where they don't feel like they have to be accountable to the public. And then it's a steep learning curve. The problem is every time they fail, somebody loses life. Isn't that a tragedy, Hermela?
Yeah, it seems to be trial and error. I mean, like I said, there is so much communication on this, but obviously it wasn't enough, and it seems like it didn't get down to all of the people. And so, not to be in the game of predicting, but do you think this will end with the government doing something similar to what they did with the Orthodox Church, where they had to kind of come in and create peace, or do you think that this could actually escalate?
I hope they would do the first, right? Just to start negotiations and dialogue, calm down the nerves of people, tell them, build some confidence, saying, this is not about the Amharas alone. This is about Somali region, Southern Oromia region, and that these young people are not going to, be disarmed, but be transferred and reintegrated into the federal forces. And whatever security threats that the Amhara public feels from Tigray, that would be taken care of and handled by the federal forces in a manner, by the way, which is not just going to appease the Amharas, but also secure the confidence of the Tigrayans, right? I know it's a tall order. I know sitting here talking about these policy options sounds very easy, and it's not when you are in the thick of it. But what other option do we have? The other option is to escalate this and to, find ourselves engulfed in another round of violence in just a space of 5 years. And I for one, and I can tell for a lot of people that I know of, this country is exhausted. We simply cannot afford another cycle of violence, Hermela.
Do you think the timing of this has anything to do with outside pressure?
What do you mean by outside pressure?
The U.S. Do you think the timing of this? I guess no need to speak in code, right? No, I mean it's obviously speculation, right? You have Secretary of Clinton that went to Ethiopia, I believe it was a few weeks ago, and coming back, there were some statements about the atrocities committed by all sides made, some reference to Western Tigray, and then that's when we saw some things move along. The TPLF being getting taken off the terrorism list, the interim administration created with Getachew Reda. So just a question, is that something that people think, that the timing of this is being sped up because of maybe there's questions about the IMF loans that Ethiopia really needs, and is that why they're moving on this at the time that they are?
I think there is something about that something to be said about that. For instance, there would be spring conferences of the IMF and the World Bank, which is going to review about the aid and the loans package that Ethiopia is going to be allowed to have now that the war was concluded. And the IMF team was in Addis. They spent, I think, around 3 weeks hashing this out with, the government ministers. One of the things that the IMF economists, true to their ilk, right, the Chicago economists keep harping on, is that Ethiopia is spending a lot on defense, right? So stressing, tightening up your fiscal belt, which means, shave off your expenditure on buying weapons and missiles and, reduce down the number of people that serve in your armed forces, special forces. And as you know, a lot of these regional forces are actually funded by budget that comes from the federal government. It's not like the regional states collect taxes to support their, armed forces. So at the end of the day, who gets to foot the bill is the federal government. And where does the federal government get the money? A lot of the times it's either grants or loans, concessional loans. So the IMF, in a very roundabout way, would have something to say about getting rid of this bulge of expenditure on defense and security, be it by the federal government or the regional governments. So when they do that, when the Washington consensus arrives in Addis, you should expect, ripple effects in Bahar Dar, right? So This may not even have anything to do with, who's in power. Is it the Oromos or the Amharas? It may have everything to do with, the federal government should do this if you need some dollars in your accounts. And it's sometimes it comes that way. So it's, so these neoliberal packages mean, you have to shave off, you have to cut down on your public expenditure, one of which, of course, is defense. The other equation to this is, they keep mentioning about accountability and transitional justice mechanisms, right? And on that list of accountability, which is, which Western analysts, including the secretary himself, talk about, is there is an apportionment of blame, Hermela. You've noticed it. Like, for instance, they said the Eritrean forces, the Amhara forces, TPLF, and the federal government committed war crimes. And then they funneled it down, and they said, but only the three, the Eritrean government, the federal forces, and the Amharas committed crimes against humanity, right? And then they funneled it down, and they said, well, the Amhara forces alone did ethnic cleansing. And that,
it stuck out to me. I mean, I think that, that is, so I wonder, I always wonder who the Ethiopian diaspora thinks the US is like really supporting. Is it the TPLF? Because it seems like everyone's trying to work with diplomats. I mean, as they should. I mean, it's their right to. The US has a lot of power and therefore has a lot of influence. And if there's issues that you think that they can help you with, it makes sense. But where do you think they're actually using their power as far as the US government goes?
Obviously, a lot of this is speculation because, Foggy Bottom is very far from my home, Hermela. But my thinking is there are geopolitical calculations, computations in what they think is happening in Addis. One thing for real is they did not like the standing of Abiy Ahmed on a number of scores, on a host of scores. GERD negotiations and how Ethiopia said no to the Trump suggestion, right? That's when it started. Then the Democrats came and they totally sided with the TPLF, despite mounting evidence and intelligence on their part that, this was not started by the federal government, but by the TPLF. They saved the TPLF. I mean, we should say this flat out. Had it not been for pressure on the part of the United States and Western powers, the TPLF, as we know it, may not have survived the war, right? And why are they doing that? They're very wary of the Chinese expansion. They're very wary about the place of Eritrea in Ethiopia's politics and the place of Eritrea in Red Sea. They're worried about the role of Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea in the Horn of Africa. And so I don't think the Abiy Ahmed administration is, a very good friend, to say the least, of the US, right? But that does not mean they would not use, be it the government or other alternative forces, to exert influence on Addis Ababa. Do I think what is happening in Amhara region right now is somewhat an extension of that interest? I very much doubt it. I very much doubt it. I think a lot of it has to do with the mismanagement and the miscommunication that you and me talked about. And a lot of it, I think, would have been resolved if there was more caution and more strategy in terms of communicating and building public confidence towards something that benefits everybody. You don't want to have a country of warlords where every region is heavily militarized. And I haven't heard of anybody who in principle rejected the notion that special forces be disarmed.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The conversation, continues to shift a little bit as the situation shifts. Dara Sakasa, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Really appreciate it.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me, Hermela. Have a good rest of the day.
You
Bye-bye.
too.